Thank you, Rich. Okay, now we're going to all get a grip. Dr. Norm Jacknis is the director of Cisco's IBSG Public Sector Group. He's a globally recognized expert in government innovation and transformation. And before joining Cisco in February of '08, he served more than 10 years as CIO and Commissioner of Westchester County, New York government, where he was responsible for all the government's technology, internet, broadband activities, as well as technology-based economic development. In addition to the county, provided these services to municipalities and other nonprofit community organizations. Under his leadership, the county won numerous awards, including the Center for Digital Government's top 10 digital counties in the country. He has also been recognized by Government Technology Magazine, actually selected as one of the nation's top 25 doers, dreamers, and drivers who, using technology, broke bureaucratic inertia to better serve the public. At Cisco, he has worked extensively and in depth with the National Association of Counties and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, where he is developing a strategy for the economic viability of American cities in 2030. Dr. Jacknis received his doctorate, his master's, and his bachelor's degree from Princeton University, and I want to warn you up front that you're going to see slides that are heavily populated, okay? And we allowed it because we know you're going to want to quote this man. So it'll all be available on our website, okay? So nobody has a breakdown trying to follow. It'll all be available on our website, and we'll make sure that you have that, as well as the rest of the information from the symposium. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Norm Jacknis.
Are we on? Good. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. I'm actually a little bit afraid to get up after all of this prelude. It's like, you know, the coming attractions show movie, and then you show up and the movie's not as good as the coming attraction. But anyway, I'm going to, if you don't mind, since most of what you want to see is not me, but the slides, I'm going to walk around the room partly so I can actually see which slide I'm on. What we're doing here is based on work that I was asked to do by the U.S. Conference of Mayors. They came to me and they said, the world is changing. Will you please help us figure out what strategy we need to ensure the economic viability of American cities in 20 years, the year 2030. And so this is kind of a report on what we learned and the kind of things that communities can do. And I should say, by the way, that I was in the session this morning and here last night. It is really inspiring to see a community, as the title says, seize your destiny. So I'm quite pleased to be speaking here. As Jackie said, I have a lot of slides. I'm going to go through them fast. Don't worry about reading them all. I'll tell you what's really important for now. And anybody who wants to dive deep into any of this stuff, it will be available on the web. So I'm not one of those folks who ends up just reading the text on the screen. You'll see that soon enough. Okay. Economic growth. Basic stuff. Back to Adam Smith. Two things drive economic growth in a society like ours. One is specialization, and the other is creating new knowledge and innovations, and then spreading them around. And this is why cities during the industrial era became our engines of economic growth, because they put people together. So that millions of people were all together. They could accelerate this process of innovation and specialize, and it was a virtuous circle. And you even had phenomena like this that if those of you involved in economic development will hear about clustering. This is not a new idea. This is an example going back to 1920s. 1922, the major film studios were already in Hollywood clustering together. This is before there were talkies, as they were called. This is before there was color in movies. Before movies were X-dominant, as they became later on. Okay, so this is sort of how we've all been taught to think, right? But things are changing. For example, Princeton professor of economics, Paul Krugman, he's actually a professional economist, not just a commentator. And he won the Nobel Prize for his work on what was called economic geography. And it was actually the intellectual foundation for a lot of the cluster strategies you've heard about in government. So he got the award and he went to Stockholm and thanked them very much for the prize and said, oh, and by the way, this stuff was right when I actually did the research 20 years ago, but things are changing. This whole clustering thing is really diminishing. And in fact, even in his speech, he made reference to Akron, Ohio. And he said, everybody today talks about Silicon Valley, but if you look at the concentration, the employment effect, Akron, Ohio, in its heyday, had much more than anything you're seeing in Silicon Valley. Another study done, 300,000 establishments, basically no clustering effect was found in looking at all 300,000 businesses in the state of Pennsylvania. Not just in the US, in Norway, they have the same kind of thing and said clustering doesn't really have an impact on innovation. Stuff is going on, right? Wall Street. The president said I'm from New York. I'm actually north of New York. I actually live in the country, so I'm not sure that I can sort of say this kind of thing. But anyway, Frank Sinatra had the song he made famous, and there's a line in there, if I can make it in New York, I'll make it anywhere. And the implication was that you had to be in New York to succeed. Well, that's actually been turned on its head. So a couple of years ago, there was a story in the New York Times that the New York Stock Exchange had lost about half of its market share in the trading of American securities. And one of the biggest competitors that stole market share from it was something called the Bats Exchange. Bats Exchange is in Lenexa, Kansas, about 14 miles outside of Kansas City, Kansas, not even Kansas City, Missouri. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, I had never heard of Lenexa, Kansas as being the center of high finance. But with the internet today, you can do this kind of thing. And so then there was a story about a year ago from Associated Press, which I thought was really funny. It says, what do you do when a cathedral of capitalism becomes antiquated? You turn it into New York's best party space. It's actually true, I've been to parties there. And it's a little funny, but it actually begins to tell you what's happening to cities. Cities, as I pointed out in the industrial, there used to be centers of production, and now they're much more centers of consumption. And of living. It's a completely different kind of view of what you're supposed to be doing with cities, both big and small. And in fact, even the whole idea of the big cities has changed. So it used to be that the richest cities were the biggest cities, and now it's the best connected cities. And some fairly big cities are not doing all that well. Okay, next big trend that's important here. And it's just as important as anything I'm going to talk about in terms of the basics of communication. U.S. employment trends. In the year 1900, 71% of the American people made food or things. 100 years later, it completely switched around. And it's not that the U.S. is no longer a major manufacturing power. We are. And manufacturing is still very important. It's just we've gotten so good at it that we can do it with a lot fewer people. By the way, this is not the first time this has happened in our history. Just because the manufacturing change is recent, we have it in our minds. Same thing happened with agriculture. We are one of the world's great agricultural powers, and we have 2% of our people on the farm. And so this means that a lot of people are doing something different, not just, by the way, in the US, the rest of the world is catching up to us in this trend. At the height of the industrial era, you had these great pictures of thousands and thousands of men, and it was almost all men, coming into these factory plants. And they concentrated jobs, and this was important, and people would say, we're doing well because we have thousands of men going into the factory. And then when the service economy came around, everybody expected office towers to do the same thing. It would concentrate white-collar employment, service economy employment. And then what happened? This is not just since the recession. This has been going on for years. Jones Lang LaSalle is a big real estate company, and they said, you know, the rule of thumb used to be 200 square feet per employee. By 2015, we're down to 50 square feet per employee. Companies like IBM, and I'd add Cisco, and a lot of others have about half of their employees and even half of their executive corps not working in the offices. And this is not just high tech, it's advertising, it's any kind of business where people don't have to physically be in the same place. So, why is that? There's communications everywhere. And this is important because if a lot more people are creating stuff that's intangible and involved with services, and they can do that anywhere, right? Internet growth is one of the phenomena. Now, all of you recognize how much communications in terms of telephone communications have changed. I'm assuming almost everybody here has a cell phone, for example, but it's also internet, and it's not stopping. We're going to have quadruple the internet traffic by 2015. Every minute now, as we go by, every second, as we sit here, there's a million video minutes that are being sent over the internet. It's just incredible how much this has gone around. And there are 3 billion internet users, and as more phones get smart, they're on the internet too. They're just little computers, even though we call them phones. In fact, if you look at most of the teenagers who you might know of, more than half their time is spent not talking, but actually using the device as a computer. So this opens up all kinds of interesting possibilities that you would need to think about. And I love this little one. This is a little town called Ten Sleep in Wyoming. And 300 people, but they're connected. So their English teachers can teach students in Asia 24 hours a day, and the people still live there and are doing quite well. The other side of this, you get the cartoon there on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. It's an old cartoon. It's funny. Obviously, it's not true. At least, my dog isn't smart enough. But the picture on the right, though, is much more dramatic, although you don't know what it means yet. It was a picture taken by a colleague of mine in India. That's an internet shack. So while dogs don't really go on the internet, there are American consumers and companies that are getting service from Indian entrepreneurs who are working out of a shack, and the people getting the service have no idea. Not just the kind of communications we have today with text and voice, but the thing that's going to make the difference is video communications. This is going forward. And this is the reason why, I'm not going to read all this to you. The key point here is that face-to-face communications communicates a lot more than just the text. 93% of what we do as human beings when we communicate is not the text, it's the body language and all the rest of that. So to the extent that we can deliver the equivalent of face-to-face communications over the internet, things will really dramatically change. We're not there yet, but we're getting close. Corporate video conferencing, this kind of thing, has been increased. Roughly 2/3 of businesses are going to be having this kind of thing within a couple of years. You have it at home. It's Google Hangouts. Apple provided this kind of high-quality visual experience on their iPhone with FaceTime. Facebook has the same kind of thing. And it's not just sort of 20-somethings. One of the things driving video and Skype on the internet are the grandparents wanting to talk to the grandkids, right? And it is amazing. Everybody talks about how hard it is for the seniors to learn how to use technology. You get this kind of motivation, they learn in 5 minutes. It's not just computer screens either. When I talk about video, I really mean the full range of video. So the Japanese made a proposal as part of the 2022 World Cup soccer match that they would provide a holographic representation of what was on the field. The reason for that is in soccer, the way the field is here and the stands are here, there's no perfect seat because the action's always moving. This way you could actually see it, right? And they figured by 2022, we'd have holographs, right? I know a lot of you looking at me like, oh, really? Okay. Take a little break. Hopefully I can get this going. Sound? Way before, and I swear this is true, and I owe it all to you. Okay, I didn't just do that to wake you up. Black Eyed Peas are in France. This is broadcast on national television in France. It's a big concert. It's a big deal. And uh-oh, 2 of the 4 lead singers couldn't get there. So 2 of those people are delivered by a holographic telepresence. Now, I'm not going to ask you to guess which they are. I don't want to embarrass anybody. Everybody sort of guesses one right, but then it's really surprised by the other. So let's just see. Maybe. You want to... There you go. That's last year. So this stuff is happening. So it's not yet today, but by 2030, at the latest, you're going to have a world of ubiquitous, high-quality visual communications. So the kind of thing that you used to have to be in a big city for, you don't necessarily need to be in a big city for anymore. So how do economic kind of change as a result? Well, in the old economy, Economic activity was tied to a particular place, an office building or a store or a factory or whatever. And big companies are really important. And you had this phenomenon called economic hunting where the mayor or the governor would say, I convinced XYZ company to move 1,000 jobs here in a plant. Markets were local. The bottom was actually very important. Quality of life was traded off for the sake of growth. And you can see that happening now in China as they're going through their industrialization and have incredibly bad pollution. But they all say, yeah, we know it's bad. When our people are rich enough, we'll deal with it. And big companies are no longer providing lots and lots of jobs. The last 4 decades, the Fortune 500 have had no net increase in employment in the US. Now, they've had some increases in employment elsewhere in the world, but not the US. And they describe themselves as being global. So Nestle, which is, I think, actually a Swiss company, you go to their website, they are not anywhere, but they're everywhere. That's their attitude. The bottom on the right, this is a little obscure, but I thought it's really sort of important to tell you how far we've come. So there was another economist named Ronald Coase who won the Nobel Prize for work he did back in 1937 called The Theory of the Firm. And the reason, and the question he was trying to answer was, in traditional economics, we're told the most efficient place to get anything done is in the marketplace. So how do we have these huge corporations that are not operating on marketplace principles? And he figured out that there's a cost doing everything in the marketplace. Every single time you needed somebody to take dictation, if you had to go out in the marketplace, it was inefficient. And so the corporation provided the glue that allowed people to collaborate. So now we come to the year 2008 with a professor at NYU named Clay Shirky, who wrote a book, Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations. And he pointed out today the internet provides that same kind of glue, that ability for people to work together and in very large enterprises without having to have the corporate organization. And of course the examples are obvious. Anybody ever use Wikipedia here? That's a good example of something that was created from this large crowd based on the internet's ability to allow people to collaborate. For the same reason that big companies aren't, really moving the kind of jobs, a lot of the incentive programs that you've seen historically around the country are getting less and less important or less useful. And it's not, there are always examples where you'll see that somebody was successful in this. But if you look at the total, history of these things, in the last 10 years or so, they've been less and less effective in creating jobs. In a number of states, they've actually had audits on these things, and looking at the program in total, with all of the money was put out, there had been no net job increase. The example I love about this is a company called Accenture. You may have heard of them. They are the world's largest consulting company. And they decided, I think it was a year or so ago, to move their world headquarters to Dublin, Ireland. And the mayor, of course, was very happy about this. And he issued a great press release. And unusual, most of the time it's just reported. This time, a reporter at the Wall Street Journal decided to follow up because it was very curious, right? What was this American company doing in Ireland? Well, the reason they were doing it is for tax reasons. But he followed up, and he asked them, well, so how many people are you moving? And they said, oh, probably just a few, maybe a couple of people, because our CEO is based in Boston, our COO is based in Texas. We're a worldwide organization. Our people are out there, and they're connected every day by the internet. Why should we move anybody? By the way, talk about manufacturing. We think about the industrial age. We think about manufacturing. Even manufacturing is going to begin to be affected by some of these things. There's this phenomenon called 3D printing, where people can make certain kinds of parts at home. So it's going to even decentralize manufacturing to an extent. So one of the lessons you learn about going to the future is the individual increasingly becomes the key unit of economic activity. In fact, the job growth that's existed in this country has come from small enterprises, and particularly the sort of so-called gazelles, fast-growing small enterprises. The way I like to put it is the old style, people thought about one entrepreneur CEO who had 50,000 folks following his orders. Now it's one entrepreneur CEO maybe to 50 people, or 1 to 5. Because there are a tremendous number of people, not everybody, but a tremendous number of people who do have an entrepreneurial spirit, and in this economy they can do it. This has implications for where government should be focusing its economic development efforts, by the way. If this is shifting to an individual focus, it means you need to worry about what the individual capacity is as much as the business organization capacity. So, future economy rules. Work will happen everywhere. I'm an example. I actually, when I'm home, I work from home. I do everything, video conferencing, anything you can name, and most of the people I work with are in the same position. So it's also a place where I buy things. So I don't visit stores and I don't visit office buildings. What we do with those places in the future when there are a lot more people like me is going to be an interesting question. But we're no longer sort of tying these things down. And there's this whole movement called economic gardening now, which is an attempt among economic development folks to really think about how they can grow the resources that already exist in their community as opposed to trying to believing that there's going to be some Santa Claus who's going to come in and drop a lot of jobs locally. And economic growth also, by the way, as a result of these two things, is not necessarily the same as commercial real estate development. So the last point I make is quality of life increases economic competitiveness. I'm going to get to that later a little bit more. So basic point here, I really want to say we're not talking about the laws of the world changing. They're not. Laws of economics, the basic kinds of things we do stay the same. What is different is that physical proximity is no longer the only or even the dominant way that these kinds of transactions are going to occur. So how do you measure a community's economic success? And I really sort of put this in a somewhat extreme form to really draw out the difference. Is it the total revenues of companies that might happen to have a postal address in your city? Or is it the amount of money that the residents have in their pockets? I think going forward in the future, the real measure, the honest measure is how well are the people who live here doing? And as I pointed out, people can live and work anywhere they want to, which is actually a great advantage for mid-sized American cities. We've talked, Blue and I've talked about this, is the real future is going to be made in places like this because you now have the global economy available to you. But you know, when most people can work anywhere they want to, where would they choose to live and work? Okay, that leads to four parts of a new economic strategy for communities. Number one, build a platform for learning. Now, you heard a lot about this morning. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but this is important. You heard a lot about K-12. The most important learning will be for people after they've left high school or even college, because jobs are changing, and the average 45-year-old, according to the Labor Department these days, has had job tenure of 4.1 years on each of the jobs they've had so far in their careers. And that's not going to get any better. So you see all these things just for the last few months about you need new skills, learn a new skill. In Europe even, new skills for new jobs. Where are you going to find this stuff? Fortunately, the people who created this problem on the internet have a solution for you. So the universities, major universities that don't need to do this stuff because they get people to pay lots of money to sit in their cloistered classrooms, have begun to go online. edX is a project of MIT and Harvard University. One of the things that's interesting about this is it's free, and they will also give you a certificate that you actually completed the course. Not quite a degree, but you know, if you want to learn something and it says, hey, MIT or Harvard says I learned this, that's pretty convincing to an employer. You have Coursera, which is an association of 33 universities. It's got Princeton and Stanford, and it's got Ohio State, by the way, that all are offering online courses for free. Udacity, this was started by a professor at Stanford. You may have heard of this thing. He put out a course on some computer topic and had like 150,000 people worldwide who signed up for the course. And he said, hey, there's a new way of doing higher education here. I'm going to set up a company that will do it this way. University of Third Age, it's been around 30 years. You probably haven't heard about it because it mostly works in the former British Commonwealth countries and in the UK. But this is where seniors are teaching seniors. You take your life experience, and no matter what the field, and you have a classroom of other seniors who need to learn, who want to learn. And there are some other relationships here to this I'll explain in a minute. And then there are many other services, all kinds of video online. It's just enormous. There's probably nothing that you would need to learn that you can't find a way to learn online. And it's not just traditional delivery of content, the way we were all brought up in school. This is a public school, public high school in New York that's completely threw out the curriculum, and the students learn everything via games. And they collaborate with each other, by the way. And then even students mentoring students. This is actually, we started something like this before the iPads were out, in which we realized that college students who are very effective mentors to high school students to keep them on track and understand what they needed to do to be able to get to college. But you can use it in all sorts of ways, and a lot of the ideas you talked about this morning can take advantage of this sort of capability. Okay, that's, and the final thing, libraries. I'm very much involved with libraries. It has nothing to do with Cisco, but I've been a library trustee for a long time, and so I've been involved. Libraries are actually a very good place to task for all this information. So there's all this stuff online, all kinds of subjects. By the way, a lot of different learning styles are accommodated online. So that's one thing we didn't talk about too much this morning, but you now have a world in which, depending upon how you learn, you can find the right place to learn it. Librarians are actually skilled at organizing all this, and somebody ought to be asking every local library, pull this together for my community so that you know, people can walk in and say, I need to understand something about chemistry, and they'll be able to point you in the right direction. Along those lines, there's something called the Digital Public Library of America. It's a nationwide project now among a whole variety of innovators, both librarians and non-librarians, and I would suggest anybody who has an interest in this to get involved with DPLA. They're really doing groundbreaking work on almost like how we're organizing the future of knowledge. Okay, next, build a platform for innovation that will increase people's income potential. So everybody, you've heard about this, everybody talks about innovation. Both presidential candidates, every senator and governor, and it's true, but how does it happen in a networked world? How does it happen today? Well, we all have this image that we have to sort of educate these geniuses and put them off on a hill somewhere, and they'll come down from the hill, not with the 10 Commandments, but with a great new idea. It doesn't work that way. It's a collaborative act. One of the things that's been studied about how innovation actually occurs, it's not from lone geniuses, it's from people who are connected to diverse sets of ideas. So they think to themselves, well, I'm trying to solve this particular problem here. Somebody else did that over there, different subject, but I could take that same kind of idea and apply it here. That's how it usually happens. Stephen Johnson wrote a very good book. You might have a chance to read this if you're interested in this subject. This is how innovation happened. Chance favors the connected mind. Albert Einstein, who I think most of us would say is probably the classic example of that genius, right? He said the secret to creativity is knowing how to hide your fluorescence, right? And of course, this great cartoon from the New Yorker, I get my best ideas in airports speaking at other people's laptops, right? It's a collaborative act whether or not you have the cooperation of your collaborators. So what do you do? And by the way, here's some other proof. I'm sorry. The federal government and a lot of the researchers and the drug companies got together and said, we really need to understand Alzheimer's. They started this project all open source. The pharmaceutical companies, who are usually the first people around to defend their intellectual property rights and sort of keep things secret, said, this is going so well, we're going to continue it and not claim any patent rights on this stuff, because we realize this collaboration is the way that major new scientific things are going to happen. And then this was also part of a whole movement. I don't know if you heard about this, called open innovation, which has had a big impact in corporate America. The initial leader of this was the R&D VP at Procter & Gamble. And he basically pointed out to his CEO, we have 7,500 world-class scientists in R&D, but there are another 1.5 million world-class scientists outside who could also help make new products. And so we need to get all the brains in the world working for us, not just 7,500 we might have on our payroll. And so as a result, Procter & Gamble has had fantastic success getting new ideas that they then can commercialize. And this has picked up, and a variety of people are doing it, including my own company. Netflix gave out a $1 million reward to some team that had never been involved in the entertainment business, but figured out the best way to predict what movie you would like next based on what you said about the last one you saw. And Swiffer, I guess, was one of the examples of something that came through open innovation. For those who ever used I guess it's really not a mop, a Swiffer. And there are a bunch of these things that are out there. There's something called Innova Hub, Idea Connection, yet to come. This is out there, and I really think it's important that people understand that ideas are out there for them, and that they should participate in this movement. Okay, connecting entrepreneurs to the global economic system. I mentioned before how important entrepreneurs were to economic growth. You need to figure out how you can connect them to worldwide opportunities. And there are a couple of things that's important to note. Number one is there's now a global flow of capital. Obviously, there's still a lot of venture capital in Silicon Valley and in Boston, New York, but there's a lot now that's out there that's available to entrepreneurs in this town. and some new ways of thinking. So even Kickstarter, which is sort of an idea that people can propose an idea, see who signs up, and then basically, and it's all based on the internet. This is an important point. Everybody, when I go around talking to government officials, everybody wants to have Stanford University or Princeton or MIT in their backyard. And I point out to them, those places didn't happen overnight, and they're not going to happen overnight in your city. Fortunately, you don't have to have it, because all the research that they're doing is available. And so what you need to do is make sure that your entrepreneurs know about that research. And by the way, I know there are a lot of commercialization programs that go on in universities, and they're worth doing, but I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs, you let them know what's happening, and they'll figure out how to make money out of it. They're quite good at that. So the most important thing is making sure that they're in that swim, in that flow of new ideas. And again, I point out the libraries can be almost be their corporate librarian for the entrepreneurs. And some cities have already done this sort of thing. You can connect entrepreneurs to all those sources of services. So if it turns out that the best person to do advertising for a local entrepreneur here is in New York, they can be connected. In the old days, it would have been expensive going back and forth. You would have paid one way or the other. Now you don't have to do that. And one of the things we did in government is when the government was sort of the leader in terms of having video conferencing initially, several years ago, we said any entrepreneur who needed to connect up via video conferencing to particularly worldwide potential partners could come to a government office building and use our equipment to make that connection. So there are very simple things you can do to make it easier for all those entrepreneurs to grow. Even this thing, I love this, is Startup Nomads. This is an example of the kind of thing you see on the internet, where if you are in a startup and you need to have particular skill, they'll have people sign up all over the world to offer those skills. Okay. Another thing, somebody talked about, there's been a lot of talk here about the difference between us and the younger generation that are digital natives. I'm not going to go too far about that. I think it's sort of hard to generalize about generations, but I think it's important to realize that there is a population of students graduating from colleges now who can be very helpful. So one of the things that made us successful as an agricultural power was the Agricultural Extension Service, because it helped diffuse new ideas among farmers and sort of pushed innovation faster. You can do the same thing today with your small businesses, and you can have a way, particularly for those college students who are unemployed, to go in and help small businesses figure out how they can take advantage of this global economy on the internet. Don't forget about seniors. This is actually couple important points here. One is the fastest growing new group of entrepreneurs are seniors, or people at least over 55. And the other reason for this is we tend to think of people who are old as being old fogies. That's the expression, right? The reality is, for most innovation, the kind of innovation that actually is successful in economic activities, the creativity that seniors develop over a lifetime is actually much more useful than the crazy ideas that a 20-year-old might have. And it goes back to the point about how does innovation happen. It happens by putting together diverse ideas. Well, if you've had a lifetime of experience in diverse places, you can put those ideas together much more easily than a 20-year-old who hasn't had that kind of experience. But, like anybody else who might be creative, if you're not in the flow of new ideas, that potential is going to shrivel up. And what do we do with people? For every year you get out of college, you're less and less exposed to new ideas. So there's a tremendous potential here, aside from solving some major economic problems we have in our society, about how we can have seniors be more productive so they're not just a cost center for government. So this is an important part of what we need to do. Another thing, and I know I'm talking about this, and you might think, oh, this is all high tech and whatever. No, it's not. So, rural Nova Scotia. This is about as remote a place as you can imagine. It's sitting out there in the North Atlantic, and they decided to do broadband, and their greatest successes, and I love this, were low tech. So here's this wonderful lady. Actually, unfortunately, I think she passed away recently, fairly young, actually. She was the wife of a lobsterman, and her job in the family was to make the bait bags that they put the bait in for the lobster traps. And they had this broadband, and she's saying, well, how am I going to use this? The internet. And they said, well, just put your stuff on, and whatever. Maybe you can sell bait bags to some other lobsterman somewhere who doesn't have a wife who's willing to do this. So, okay, so she did it. And she sold some. And then because she was on the internet, so now you're on the global stage, it turned out there was a woman who had a store in Madison Avenue in New York who said, this is wonderful stuff. My young, fashionable 20-something career women would love to have those as pocketbooks. And so she sold 1,000 of these a year at a very nice price to a store in Madison Avenue. Not the only example, by the way, in Nova Scotia. There's this one, too. This is from a hammock shop. A husband and wife team built hammocks in Nova Scotia. They, too, ended up on the internet, and one thing led to another, and now they're sort of in a store in New York. Really is bringing people together and providing opportunities for low-tech businesses who were nowhere near centers of commerce before. Number 4, creating a new quality of life. You know, I pointed out before, many people choose where to live based on quality of life. And I sort of sometimes tell mayors that the sort of thing you'd try to do to encourage tourists to come, you're going to have to start doing to keep people in your town. You really need to think about it that way. And I also point out quality of life means different things. And I'm not sure this happened in the Canton area, but in a number of larger cities around the country a few years ago, there was this idea that we all needed an artist colony, and that would somehow generate economic growth. And so they all copied from each other, and it didn't work. People know what they don't like, but they have different things that they like. So figure out what the strength is. I mean, clearly the family lifestyle that you can have in a place like this is a major strength, so you should play on that. You know, and you really think about different parts of the country, and they should sort of figure out what is their major attraction. It's almost like a community now has to think like a corporate marketing person. You know, what's the market segment that I can attract? And quality of life, by the way, includes citizen experience. So you really have to engage citizens. It's part of the reason why they want to be there. And I just give 2 quick examples. This is one, actually, it's from New York, although it's been used all over the world. It's called Betaville. And it's a tool that allows citizens to work together to think about how they might change their community or to react when a developer comes in and makes some suggestion for some big new project. This other one was done in Oakland County, Michigan, which is suburban Detroit. As you know, in Michigan, they've really had tremendous decline in government revenues. So they thought about this and said, you know, there are a lot of things that we do that people could do better helping each other, but they need our help every once in a while if it's something special. So they started this where they had usually mothers whose kids, who were looking to put their kids into a summer recreation program, who would end up being linked up to another mother who did that a year or 2 before. And if there's something special, like a kid had autism, whatever, then they'd bring into the conversation the specialist in the county government who had the skills to help resolve that problem. But everybody became part of the delivery of public services, not just the few paid people. You can also create new destinations that combine physical and virtual spaces. And they're sometimes very simple. This is from a small city in Denmark. I love this picture. They just decided, well, come in with your smartphone, and together you can create a piece of digital art, and we'll have people vote on it, and the ones that are really good we'll post up on the walls as our paintings. Hardly any investment on their part. There's this example in, this was New York City, but it can be done anywhere. Again, it's kind of a thing to create the sense of being fun. They gave people these little these bracelets that measured their pulse and sort of little Wi-Fi things. And in the parts of the park where there was the greatest activity, they'd have these laser lights. Is he still over there? If I want to just try this one quickly. So you have that kind of thing where you combine the digital world and the physical world, and that actually was in New York in Times Square, right? I mean, and it was so successful that the police asked them to shift up the screen because drivers were stopping to look, and it was really causing traffic jam. You don't need to do that in New York. It can be done anywhere. There's augmented reality, so you can use the smartphone and you can sort of set your community and give the history. So you walk by in an area, and you can give the history of what that was like, and talk about students, and be fantastic for them to understand what used to be there, and you can even show historical pictures of what used to be there. So there's all this kind of ways of combining the virtual and physical, and it's not just computers. In fact, that's the least important stuff. The walls become screens, and you don't need keyboards. So there are a couple examples of this. It's just a wall as a screen, and you can move it around. It's not even a fixed screen. This was done a couple of years ago, and this is quite simple to do. Virtual shopping even. I'm working on a project in which we're putting this sort of thing in transportation spaces, bus stops, and that kind of thing, where you go in and it is a large screen, but you don't need to have any particular thing. You can point to it, look at stuff, and buy things, and have it delivered if it needs to be delivered, or if it's a virtual thing, you get it right there. Floors can be displays. Literally anything you can project onto is a display. Literally anything. I have some other examples, even your hands, or some, people can actually project like a telephone thing on their hands and press in the numbers. And by the way, it's not just flat. You can have flexible displays. So if you happen to own street lights or something like that, you can put them wrap around, right? In Spain, they had this thing called iPavement. For those of you doing broadband projects, basically it's connected to the internet, and then you use Bluetooth or whatever as you're walking down the street. So you're always connected. In Australia, they did this thing, piano stairs. Originally, the idea behind this is that as you step on each of the keys, it makes the sound of a piano. It's just, it's connected to the internet and sound system. It's pretty simple stuff. They actually did this for public health reasons, so that people would stop taking the elevators. They have as much of an obesity problem in Australia as we do, I guess. And it was so much fun. People loved this stuff, and it worked. And just to give you a final example before I sum up, you can even do things like this, where you take an old building in London, and it becomes a canvas for the city of Vienna. If you can start the video. It's nothing more than a computer connected to the internet and using laser lights. You can do anything. Project one part of town to another, one part of the state to another. Okay, conclusions, your choices. I'm not going to read all this to you. There's some fun quotes here. The first one's the obvious one from Wayne Gretzky. It's the great hockey player that plays where the puck will be, not where it is now. So the future is important. And I would also say for major community building, it takes a while to get these things done. So you need to get started. It's a little bit like saving for your retirement. You don't wait till you're 65 to start thinking about saving for retirement. Otherwise, you're not going to be in good shape. But the transition won't be simple. I know that. We still have a lot of the old rules in the economy that we need to play by, but we should start thinking about how to shift some of our attention and some of our investment to this newer economy. And if you do that, you will learn more than other communities do because you're getting in early in the game. The fellow who invented the word cyberspace, which you probably heard, also had this wonderful saying, the future is here, it's just not equally distributed. So this is not something that you can put off. I've already shown you examples of things that are real today that can begin to happen, and that the cities that will start adopting this are going to be the beacons for future economic growth. And it really is, every community today has this sort of fork in the road. And the thing about forks in the road, I think it was an old Yogi Berra saying about this, if I'm at a fork in the road, if you're at a fork in the road, take it. And I think the point is, you can't just sit there. Sitting there is making a decision too. And I'll end with this, tale of two cities. St. Louis and Chicago. In the early part of the 1800s, St. Louis was the Queen City of the West. It was the gateway to the West. It was the most important thing that was out there beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And the railroads came along. And the railroads wanted to go across Mississippi River to connect to St. Louis so that they could, bring together the country. For various reasons, the city fathers in St. Louis sort of were thinking about this. They knew it was coming, but they figured, well, we don't have to do much about it. And meanwhile, they're getting pressure from the boatmen, who were a special interest, who were worried about losing their business because a bridge would take away business from boatmen. So they sat on it, didn't make a decision. Meanwhile, in Chicago, which was sort of a backwater in a sense, they saw this as an opportunity. And within a few years after the Civil War, there were 1,000 rail connections into the city of Chicago. And by the year 1870, Chicago surpassed St. Louis in population, never looked back. And it's had its ups and downs, but in general, it's still a vibrant economy and it's still the biggest metropolis between the two coasts. And St. Louis has suffered in various ways. It's had its ups and downs, but you can see population, and they're still struggling. And there's even a local tie-in to this. So I was doing a little research about this community, and obviously I came across the Timken company and the great role they play in this community. And I saw that they were founded in St. Louis. They were founded in 1899 in St. Louis, and the Timken family, though, soon realized that this was not a city where you could make a future. And so they moved to this area 2 years later. So these decisions have consequences. And my recommendation to you is to keep on doing what you did this morning and think about how you can take advantage of the potential future that I'm talking about and seize your destiny. Thank you. I don't know, do you want me to take questions or? Nothing I said was, I have to change my talk. Usually people argue with me. So right,
it can't help but strike, it can't help but strike me that we're here today in real time.
Yes.
And isn't the hard part is that some things do better in real time? Or do you think, because I think if you look at some of the stuff happening on the web, you actually get the sense that you wouldn't have to leave your house at all. Where's the balancing point between real-time social experiences for an intelligent, creative community and it all happening on the web?
Well, first of all, I'm not suggesting that we're going to get into a world where it's like the Matrix movie, where we have no physical being, we're just always connected to this. But there are advantages that will come about when the video is much more useful. And you can do it in real time, and video, well, we just don't have to be in the same room. There will still be advantages to face-to-face, and obviously, I'm not going to go into it, but there are some obvious things you can only do when you're near somebody. So, I see both happening, but I just think that there's an opportunity here. Yesterday we were talking about education, I guess, and it strikes me that it's a little bit like, in the 19th century, every community had a theater. And they played music and they did acting, and then recorded music came along, and then finally the movies. And you could make a movie and take the very best actor in the country and project him to thousands of cities all over. And it really, affected a lot of those community playhouses. Now, they didn't all go out of business. Some continue, and they serve a different function, though. And the traditional professional acting stuff shifted over to the movies. I think you're going to see the same thing. We're still going to have this kind of thing, but we're also going to have the other. And all I'm suggesting is to be prepared for it. The other thing I'd say about it is part of it's cultural. It's not just, I would argue that I don't think that the internet is quite there yet. We're a little bit like the 1920s in terms of phones. You think about what you can do with your phone today, and they used to be able to do long distance in 1920, but it just wasn't as convenient. It wasn't everywhere. And I think we're in the same situation with the video on the internet. But it's not just technology, it's people's habits that will change over time as the next generations get used to these things and grow up with them. And the example I always use is my grandmother. There were phones around when my grandmother was in her 20s. There was long distance around. But when I grew up, you never called grandma except two conditions. One, something really, really trivial, and even then you shouldn't do it. Or if you're about to die, then you can call her. Anything in between, you showed up at her doorstep. For my parents' generation, they were used to doing business, to concluding business deals, to buying stuff, to talking on the phone as if it were second nature. They didn't have to see you in order to do it. For my grandchildren, they'll assume that they can always interact, and it's okay to interact visually on the internet, because they just take it for granted.
That's sort of a segue to my question, because as we watch and listen to a presentation like yours, some of us get overwhelmed about what we know, what we don't know, what's happening that we don't know about that might be happening to us, but we don't know it's going to happen. And so the technology begins to dominate, whether we're talking about development of communities or we're talking about education. But ultimately, throughout a day like this, in a week, and really every day of my life, somebody says, but what about character? What about communication between human beings? What about really looking at somebody in the eye and talking with them? Tell me about that.
You're right. You know, when the internet was first developing, and people would hear about cyberbullying or things like that, and they'd say, "Wasn't it horrible what technology is doing?" And I said, "It's not technology. The end of all these computers are people. Whatever people will do to each other, they're going to do in general, online or in the real world." And that the kinds of things we expect of people, and character is one of them, that are important in our lives like here, are also going to be important online. Particularly, actually more so in some respects. Because you think about it now, you know, when you grow up, you maybe would interact with 10,000 people. You now have the potential of interacting with 6 billion people. How are you going to choose who to trust? You know, in some respects, your reputation for character, your reputation for being a good person will be more important.
And what about the poor and the marginalized?
Right. That's a problem. And the only thing I can say is the cost of technology has come down dramatically. And so even in places like Africa, you've got a lot of people sort of getting access to the internet without realizing it by using their cell phones. There are a lot of programs like Riverside has, and I did when I was in the government, where, you know, instead of throwing away stuff, you can repurpose it and help people get connected. So I think it's not fast enough or good enough as far as I'm concerned. But you know, ultimately that problem will be solved too. But we have to pay attention to it. We just can't sort of say, "Well, I got mine," and forget everybody else. I mean, and part of the reason for that is, and it's not like a socialist thing. I'm not a socialist, but I actually think about it in terms of innovation is important. And there's some poor kid somewhere who doesn't get the education that he or she needs. That may be the poor kid who actually had the cure for cancer that I get. So I want to, you know, it becomes very personal. It's not just like a big collective thing. And I think it's having the opportunity to have people develop skills is important, but, you know, and equipping them in a way that they can do this. You know, now once they're equipped, I mean, they're on their own. It's like, you know.
Norman, question.
Sure.
You talk about social inclusiveness, which is one of the ICF's functions.
Right.
Let's talk about broadband connectivity, though. What's the size of the pipe, and what could the community do so they can have everyone online? So programs like Riverside, the entrepreneurs in Nova Scotia, and here in Canton can get online.
Well, broadband is a funny word, and it keeps on changing. You know, at one point, broadband was defined by the FCC as, I mean, what was it, 128K or something like that. It was really something you wouldn't accept on your cell phone now. I'll say two things about this, and it may surprise you since I work for Cisco. First is people are not using the connectivity they already have. I mean, that's part of the point about the lobsterman's wife in Nova Scotia. That's not a heavy broadband application, even though she had broadband. It was just she had basic connectivity of the internet, and that's all she needed to get started. So not everybody needs to have super fast broadband because they're playing some virtual game that, you know, has lots of graphics in it. But I do think that it's important for a community, if it wants to get ahead as a community as a whole, to make the investment in broadband. However that can happen, and it'll happen in different ways in different parts of the country. I've worked with the city of Chattanooga, for example, which is another mid-sized city that actually has had a lot of problems in the past. They're down south where there is a history of having publicly owned electric utilities, and one thing led to another, and the electric utility decided to create 1 gigabit connections. That's faster than anything that anybody around here has. 1 gigabit connections to every single building in the metropolitan area. And they figured out how to do it, how to get paid for, because they're very conservative. And so they did it that way. There are other cities that will do partnerships, like Steve described, with the major telecoms companies. There are even, how to describe it, sort of community-based technologies where somebody has a connection and they sort of chain up the connection, so one house helps the next house. That's been done in some parts of the world. So certainly I think you need it. I mean, if you're going to play in this game and you're going to have a future, you need to be connected, and you're going to need to be connected at higher and higher speeds. But there are lots of ways of doing it. And frankly, it's not as expensive or as daunting as a lot of people think it might be.
Dr. Jacknis, you addressed economic gardening, and the second, you also mentioned where people have money to spend. Is there a relationship or a connection between those two?
I'm sorry, between economic gardening and
economic gardening and where people are, I think you addressed it, where people are living that have money to spend.
Right. Yes, there is. And that's sort of, I think my point is that if you think about what you need to do for economic development in the future, a lot of it is to increase the income potential of the people in your community. And that's what economic gardening is focused on as well. Although, or they focus on smaller entrepreneurs, smaller companies, but it's the same idea. It's what can you do with the people who are there already? How can you give them the skills to compete in this global economy and make more money? As opposed to hoping that I'm going to bring some jobs in here that may or may not actually be appropriate for the people in the community.
Given all this change and all of this dynamic potential, what gets you excited about the Institute? Where do you see the Institute today going?
What gets me excited about the Institute is that the Institute is actually carrying this message to cities all over the world and getting them to think about what they might be doing, just like this event today. I mean, without the Institute, I don't know that there would have been this discussion in this area of Ohio before. So, between the Institute and Walsh, thank you, you can get this to happen. So they've been playing a fantastic role. And, I have to be honest, I've only been with Cisco for about 4 years. Before that, I was in the government, and I was sort of like, before that, I was in the software industry. But, there's always some skepticism when people who come from a company like Cisco talk about it. When you actually have people who are in a nonprofit who are working with cities and communities around the world, it's a little bit different. So it's not just me saying this, but it's, you're hearing this from people who are maybe closer to the position that you're in. Okay. Thank you much again, and good luck and a good future to all of you.
One more time, let's please thank Mr. Norm Jacknis for provoking us with the realities and the possibilities of a new knowledge economy. Thank you.